When it comes to using numbers in academic writing, it can be tricky to know when to write them out and when to use what's called numeric form. So in numeric form, the number is still just a number. So we have 6, or let's say 4,223, whereas written out, so if we write out the number, written out, we would write 6, and we would write, well, I'm not going to write it because it would take quite a while, but we would write out this number here as well. So which one is appropriate in what circumstance? Well, there are 4 main criteria that we can use to decide on which of these options we should go with. And let's review each of these in some detail. The first thing that can help us to decide is the length of the number. Okay, so the length of the number. And the rule of thumb is that if a number is only 1 or 2 words long, then we can typically write it out. So for instance, we can write out 200 because it's only 2 words long, as you can see. On the other hand, this big number that we had here before, there's no need to write that out because it just would take way too long. So that's the general rule of thumb. If it's not hard to write it out, then go for it. Now, a couple of minor details here. So numbers between 21 and 99 are often hyphenated. So we would write 27, let's say. And this counts as just one word. Okay, so when you're trying to figure out how long are these words or how many words are there, then this is just one word. The other thing to notice is that if you have a number that is over 1 million, so let's say you have 5 million, you're allowed to use a combination of numbers and words to express that. So instead of having to write 5 million, you can see that takes quite a while, even though it's just a couple of words if you were to write it out. What you can do here is you can use a number and a word together to express it. Our second rule has to do with whether the number is a measurement or a stat, or if it's more general in nature. Okay, so if the number is quite specific, a measurement or a statistic or something like that, then we tend to leave it in numeric form. And here are some examples. So let's say that you have a date. Let's say you're talking about July 7. You can see that under our first rule, 7 is pretty short and we should write it out. So it would be 7, but we typically don't do that, right? So cross that out and just keep it in numeric form. Same thing with literary references. So whether you're talking about a chapter or let's say some line numbers, so line 12, again, quite easy to write this out under our first rule, but we can break it with our second rule and we're just going to leave it in numeric form. Here are a few other examples of specific measurements and stats that can be in numeric form. So scores, let's say the score is 5 to 4. Statistics, so let's just talk about 28% of people said this or that. Money, okay, let's say something costs $5. Addresses, let's say you live on 23 Foggy Bottom Road. There we go. You can just leave it in numeric form. Any sort of mathematical equations or numbers, so let's say you're talking about a fraction, 7 out of 8, or something with a decimal in it. In each of these cases, what you can see here is that we have something quite specific, and it's totally fine just to leave it in numeric form. So our first two rules then kind of rub up against each other. The first one says if it's short, write it out. The second one says yeah, but if it's specific, if it's a specific kind of measurement or stat, you can leave it in numeric form. Okay, so 2 more rules to review then for when to write out numbers. And the first of these has to do with frequency. So how many numbers are you using in one sentence? And you can see here that we've used quite a few numbers, and we've left them in numeric form because there are so many of them. So even though these are fairly easy to write out, right? Doesn't take much to write out 5. And even though these are not specific measurements or stats, which is our second rule, we've still left them in numeric form, and that's fine because of the frequency of numbers here. But this is obviously a judgment call. So if you think that it's easy enough to write them out, then that's totally fine. And I think this is really a toss-up here. But at least it gives you the option. So if there is a certain frequency of numbers, you are allowed to leave them in numeric form. And then the last point has to do with clarity. Okay, so how do you achieve clarity? Let's say you're talking about 6 5-goal games. And this is a situation that often crops up in sports columns. So if you like that sort of thing, you'll see this quite often. In this case, we have two numbers here. We have 6 and 5. And we could write out both of them. We could write 6 if we wanted to. But as you'll see, these are two different measurements, right? And it can get confusing if they're both written out or both in numeric form. So when you have that, when you have two measurements right in a row, two numbers, you're allowed to kind of mix it up a little bit just to create that kind of clarity. So those are our 4 criteria for trying to figure out when to write out numbers. As you can see, it's not an exact science. These are mostly suggestions and kind of rules of thumb, but hopefully this gives you some advice as to when it's best to write out the number or leave it in numeric form.